Hi, good evening, everyone. Property wrappers. Now, one of the reasons is don't have those little blue birds for the Swift UI or the orange one for Swift, because it's still under wraps, it's still under beta. Now, a lot of things could change, hopefully with the revision 3, which is the SE0258. They've kind of finalized what property wrappers can do. They've gone through property delegates and whatnot, so it's now property wrappers. Right, so what are property wrappers? Now you would see in the videos or in the new code, you'd see a lot of things like these. Oh, the color is, okay. So you'd see a lot of these @ signs, so @state, @object binding, and so on. And if you see the third one, which you can't see very well because of the color, is @CocoaHeads, which means you can create your own. And we're going to look at what can you do with these. How can you create your own property wrappers, and what do they do? So first things first, if you have, and we don't take that badly now, if you do create apps for Android, or if you've ever done Android development, it's the same thing as annotations. So there's a catch-up here and the catch-up there, so everywhere a catch-up. So there are 3 things you need to do when you actually use property wrappers. You need to declare the wrappers. You need to then declare or use it in a class, and then instantiate it and use it. 3 simple things. So let's look at the first thing, declaring a wrapper. How do you declare it? You have the keyword @property wrapper, and then you use a struct, because what it does is basically it wraps your variable inside the struct. So we create a struct called CocoaHeads, and you can have your, the variables that would actually hold the value in it, and you need to have a property called wrapped value. Now, if you don't have that, it wouldn't work. And with that, if you actually run it, you try to compile it, it gives you a segmentation fault. Now, I would have liked that to be interactive, but I'm told no questions during the presentation. Now, why do you get a segment fault? Because it needs to have an initializer. Now, if you've done structs, you know that structs give you an automatic initializer, but the only problem here is that it's an initial value, not the same as your variable. So it doesn't really initialize your variables inside. Now, this is as of now. It could change, but as of now, with beta 3, this is what it is. So when you declare your property wrappers, you need 3 things now. You need the backing variable, you need the wrapped property, and you need an initializer. If you have these 3, you're good. Okay, I can see the colors here, not there. I hope you can see that. So these are the 3, actually 4 things, because that's the keyword that you need to use. Right. Now, the second bit, which is declare or use it in a class. So you say class CocoaHeads, and inside, instead of actually using a variable, you use the property wrapper CocoaHeads, where event type string. So it'll actually hold the value in there. And that's about it. Now, what is the advantage of using this? So you saw we had to write all the getters, the setters, and everything for in the previous slide. So what you do now is by just annotating it with CocoaHeads, you get all of that for free. So every time you want to write like 5 or 6 different variables, and you don't have to write all those getters and setters, you can actually kind of have that template, and with one annotation, you get all of that with the variable. So it cuts down on all the boilerplate code, and gives you a nice way to template your code. Instantiating and using it. So let July 19 is CocoaHeads, and print July 19.event. Now, some of you who've played with it are going to say it's going to print nothing because it's blank. If you look at the last slide, we haven't really initialized it. And when we initialize it with blank, nothing, right? And having said that, if I just created a class like this, it would have worked for me. And I can have an initializer, I can have a host, I can add so many other things to it. So what exactly is the benefit of using property wrappers? Right? No questions? You all good? As I said, one, it saves you a lot of boilerplate code. And on top of that, this is a very simple example, but if you actually get into a little more complex example, which I'm going to show you next, it actually starts making more sense of why you would actually use property wrappers. So here's an example of a property wrapper that works with the user defaults. So I'm calling it defaults, and I'm giving it a generic value type, which means it can be anything, any object, any class. So I'm giving three of my, so the first part is basically I have a key, I have a default value, which is a function, and I have defaults, which is basically I can say which user defaults do I want. So by default, I can have it as standard, and if I want, I can have my own different defaults in there. I have the initializer, which I initialize using a key, default value, and the defaults. And I set them to the, so I initialize them with the values that I send. Then I create the wrapped value. We said we need to have those three things. So we have the data that's stored, we have the initializer, and we have the wrapped value, where I have a getter, which basically gets the value from the user defaults and returns it back, and a setter, which actually sets the value in the user default, right? And then I have to use it. Now, so this is still the functions, user default get. So I get the value from the user defaults, and I set the value. So it's basically a wrapper on the previous one I'm calling this. Now, when I want to use it, I just say I have a class called user defaults, and in there I have defaults. Key is this okay? The default value is true, and I set my variable is this okay bool. Now, every time I work with is this okay, which is a Boolean, every time I set it, it gets set to the user defaults. And every time I get it from user defaults. Now, if you were to actually create 2 or 3 different values like these, there would be a lot more code you would have to write. So now you can actually see how brilliant that property wrapper is, because I can create UD as user defaults, and I print is this okay? It'll print true because I have the default value of true. And if I change it to false, and I print what is in user defaults, I'll actually get false. So every time I change it, it gets persisted to the user defaults. Now, this is only one of the things that you can do with it. There is so much more. I haven't really spoken about it because it really is quite deep. You can use the $, which makes it writable, otherwise it's readable. And it's still kind of like working out, so even I'm kind of exploring it further. And one of the things which I thought, magicians never tell, but we're all programmers, so thank God for that. So I can share how it works. So thank you.